This is Family Life in the North Country, and I have sort of a generalized question to start with today. It says, how does poverty influence children's views of the world? We often see children in very severe poverty, particularly on the media, and there are differences between being poor, though, and just not having money. Oftentimes, children who are in these circumstances don't feel that themselves. If this is what they've grown up with, they don't view the poverty the same way that somebody else does looking in on the family. I first became aware of that, quite a few years ago when I was doing field work to become a social worker as an undergraduate. I looked in on families, some of whom I thought were very poor, but the children didn't seem to feel that way. And I remembered I grew up very poor, and I never thought of myself that way. Just maybe I had a wall built up there. I knew we didn't have any money, and I think that's a big difference. A lot of families don't have money. It used to, in the depressions, and I say depressions, they used to come along, seem to be pretty more often than they do now. People didn't have money. They didn't think of themselves as poor. I saw that in Mexico. Families that they didn't have anything to speak of. Some of them lived in cactus plants tied together at the top, and that was their house. Very happy children. Things like that impress me. See some people who have millionaire mansions and very unhappy children. Same thing with parents. Well, here's another question about neighbors. From time to time, a question comes up about picking neighbors, and real estate agents are often trying to sell neighborhoods rather than houses. And the question in research, does this make a difference? And the answer is quite clearly, yes, it does. People who have neighbors who have values like their own, the children are much more likely to have the family values because these are reinforced by the neighbors. You see, that's true regardless of what those values are. If the values are high level, or pure values, that's what the children are more likely to have. If they're low values, like ghettos, you can live in a family of poverty. Same thing. You can live in a family of thieves and crooks and that sort of thing. Children will adopt the family values and the neighborhood. Parents pick the peers. A lot of parents are always blaming the peers for the children's problems. But who picks them? The parents. Parents pick where the children live. Here's another question. It said, some families I know seem to keep having trouble keeping good babysitters. How significant is that in the children's development? Some very recent research says it's very important. We all know that more and more children today are being reared by substitute homemakers, substitute mothers, substitute whatever. And the truth of the matter is that the more often children are changed, or their caretakers are changed, the more problems they seem to have. Frequent changes is a very popular experience. I know some couples who start working on that even before the children are born, trying to find a good babysitter. Excuse me, but the research evidence is crystal clear. The consistent caretaking is much better for children. Here's another one. Came up about religion and neighborhoods and communities. Every major study, and this has been studied quite a bit all over the world, every major study shows that religion in families is a positive influence. It's a positive influence on society. I'm well aware that sometimes religion makes for difficulties in families. And so be it. More often, though, the religion makes for a positive influence, much more so. And here's a question, kind of an interesting one. 74-year-old woman says, I'm 74, my husband's 76, and he seems to want to be romantic. Is there something wrong with him? Senior Citizens Council, Senior Citizens Center, question whispered to me. My answer was probably. Most 76-year-old people have something wrong with them. But wanting to be romantic is not a sign something's wrong. Maybe it's a sign of health. And maybe 50 years of marriage, that's a good sign. Maybe it's a compliment to the bride. So I told her to think about it that way. Here's one that's a popular one that in the discussions today. We see it being kicked around because we're hearing a lot about government financing of schools, different ways of schooling. The question has to do with what do I think of homeschooling. Homeschooling isn't something new. Just think about it. Weren't we all schooled at home? Didn't we all start off learning most of what we learned at home? Reminds me of a book, well, sort of an essay actually, but it was in book form, that everything I needed to know I learned in the first grade, something like that. Excuse me. The fact that homes are the first educators. Children start learning even before they're born. That's been documented now very clearly. The mothers are the first teachers. They are consistent. They model what they teach. The children are learning very quickly from mothers how to behave, what to expect. They do this in language. They do this in behavior. Some of us even had education by our siblings. For example, I was the youngest in my family, the youngest child, and I had an older brother who really delighted in coming home from school and then teaching me everything that he had thought he learned in school that day. Some of it I obviously rejected, and some of it maybe helped somewhere along the way. I had an older sister who was quite a good teacher. I thought, before I started school, I knew how to read and write and could do some numbers. That's homeschooling. There's no way around it. What we have today is a need for the community schools, whether public or parochial, for the community schools to reinforce what the home values are, the family values. Family values are typically not being reinforced today in public schools. And that causes problems. What we see, and it's I think something very serious, what we see is that the best students seem to come from schools that are not particularly well endowed financially. We're seeing parochial schools turning out a disproportionate share of the better students. We're seeing a lot of clamor today about voucher systems in education. Voucher systems which would allow the parents to pick the school. You know, all of us pay taxes, all of us pay school taxes. And Some of these proposals are to allow the parents to take their portion of school tax and apply it to any school they might choose to be the best one. Well, there are all kinds of arguments on these things both ways. But when we start looking at what students learn, where they seem to learn the most, they seem to learn more from private schools, in the private schools. I remember a comment in an education lecture one time, what a sad commentary it was, that in 50 years of public education, the greatest thing that happened was they unbolted the chairs from the floor and let the children sit in circles rather than lined up, what's called cathedral style seating. That doesn't sound like much of an achievement to me. The old academy, the Academy of Socrates, was in a circle out under a tree. Well, so people got into school and they bolted the seats down so that the children would move them and make noise. But to say that was the greatest achievement in the 20th century certainly doesn't speak much for public education in my book. The homeschooler, every mother is a homeschooler. Every father is. Who isn't? Who's a member of the family? There are several teachers in every family. Whoever lives in the home is a teacher. Excuse me. I think homeschooling needs to have some standards, but I'm not sure what would happen if the majority of the students were really dependent upon homeschooling for technical education. We're living in an age where technical education is important. Somebody suggested recently that to do away with textbooks and use computers. Well, somebody who doesn't know computers, is not computer literate, would have a great deal of difficulty in today's society if it's going in that direction. So perhaps there needs to be some kind of balance, a rather serious balance about what is this thing, homeschooling. We're looking at more and more people being allowed to work at home. So maybe people could be taught how to work at home. But that would be, again, with computers. Here's another question. So what's the most important thing for parents to do? Most important thing for parents to do. What do you think? What would you do? What kind of answer would you come up with? Well, my answer was to show by example that we appreciate life, that we can enjoy living. If children see their parents enjoying living, children want to copy the parents. I think this is where so many good intentions break down. Parents may advise their children, recommend to their children, try to teach their children to follow good examples. For example, certain moral values. But the parents may quarrel and complain about following the same moral values. In other words, what the parents are saying do, they don't seem to enjoy. I think if the parents can set the example to give generously of themselves and to enjoy it, to be gracious receivers, I think that lends a great deal for children's happiness. And we can all do that. We can learn to accept failures. We can learn that we're going to fall down. It's not the falling down that's so important, it's how we get up that counts. I think we can do that. I think we need to set the example of showing that we can really succeed, even though that there are failures. Sweet are the uses of adversity, and many are the successes of failure. In other words, to turn bad things into opportunities. Somebody has said, if you get a lemon, make lemonade. I think parents need to know how to do that and try to practice doing that. We can become more successful in doing that, any of us can, than we really customarily are going around life being. Most of us are not the best examples, and we know that. So I think that's the most important thing that a parent can do for children. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Let's get off with a little anxiety to start with on this one. It says, what can I do about my anxiety? Well, unfortunately, the answer to the question comes up, how does your anxiety suit you? I mean, what does it do for you? Sound nuts? So many people ask that, they talk about wanting to get rid of the anxiety or fears or something like that. But those of us who are working in therapeutic relationships with people, we oftentimes see that the symptom serves a purpose, some purpose for that person, that the person doesn't really want to turn loose of those symptoms quickly. Or the person may like to talk about them, but oftentimes I ask the question, do you really want to be different? How would you be different if you didn't have the anxiety? How would your life really be different? Some anxiety is necessary. Some anxiety is a necessity. You may think about it, how's that? Well, anxiety keeps me from being hit by a truck. If I'm going down the road, I have a fear of that truck coming in my lane. I better do something. But too much, of course, is crippling. Too little is dangerous. But anxiety, as most people know, it is something that interferes with their living, and it's treatable. Some cases of anxiety perhaps respond best to medication, but anxiety most of the time is a chronic fear. If you think about fear, most people can understand fear pretty easily. Anxiety is a popular word, but most of the time I find that people don't really associate it as fear. If you're anxious, you're afraid of something. It's a chronic state of fear on a lesser scale than most of the time just plain fright. But the body's reaction is the same, just on a lesser scale. And a chronic state of that may become very unhealthy. It can cause all sorts of things. That was the basis of psychosomatic medicine when it was first discovered. I remember the book by Thompson, Psychosomatic Medicine, published about 47. And it was based on that sort of thing. I studied that book rather diligently. That seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? I guess it is. Medication for some people, yes, it seems to work. Get them over the humps. Some people have panic reactions. A panic reaction is a state of terror. A person feels terrified for a moment. Usually it's very short-lived. But people who experience it, it's extremely uncomfortable. And you see them, they're afraid they're going to do something dramatic, something dangerous, hurt themselves or get hurt or allow themselves to get hurt. Most of the time, to get a person to recognize and to feel that it's going to be short-lived, just hang on there for a moment. It's going to pass. And panic attacks typically do pass, and fortunately pass very quickly. Medication for that? Oh, sometimes, but I'd prefer treating people that to learn to adjust to it and prevent it. I think most of panic attacks can be prevented. Okay, here's another one. Question. It says, what happened to "you're okay, I'm okay"? That used to be in vogue. Well, the answer is that it was in vogue when transactional analysis first came out, because that was part of the book. I'm okay, you're okay. And unfortunately, the man who came up with that sort of thing was killed in a car wreck rather young. No telling what would have developed and how he would have developed that if he'd had an opportunity to live past age 50. But that all of us have a parent in us, all of us have an adult in us, and all of us have a child in us. And sometimes a parent to parent, that's the controlling part of us. We want to control somebody. The adult part of us is supposedly we accept people as people are. The child part of us is a need to be dependent or to be selfish and hedonistic in a way. And so the transactional analysis was that different phases of us or parts of us relate to different parts of somebody else. One person in a relationship may be the parent, the controlling member, the other may be the dependent. And so on it goes. Today it's perhaps more in vogue to think, well, I'm not okay, you're not okay, but that's okay for us not to be okay. That seems to be a little bit in vogue today. It's an interesting way of approaching it. The idea was focusing on self-esteem. And today there's a little turnaround saying, okay, it's okay if you're not okay. So what? All of us have a problem. All of us have a fault of some kind. And here's another one that came in that says, a friend of mine, somewhat religious, says you're not correct in saying that parents are automatically the first and best sex educators. How do you defend yourself? Well, I think the best defense is to say something like, the matter speaks for itself. There's a Latin phrase of that, something like ipso loquitur, but think about it. Parents are the first teachers. You can't get around that. And the best ones, yes, most of the time they are the best. I've never said that parents are perfect. I wouldn't dare say that. That all parents are good teachers? No. But I think majority of parents are the best teachers that the child is going to have. And maybe it's kind of like what Winston Churchill said about democracy. It's a terrible form of government, but it's the best we have. Parents perhaps aren't the best teachers, but they're the best we have. That's my opinion. Excuse me. Here's another perspective that comes in from time to time. We see so much of this stuff in the media, reading, hearing about it. It says years ago, 50% of the husbands were said to have been unfaithful at some time in their marriage. Is that true today? Well, I think it went from 50% to something like 75. But here's something else that happened. It's time that it was found that 50% of the husbands had been unfaithful at some time during their marriage. The wives were found to be 15 to 25% of them unfaithful. And that's had to change. I think the credible evidence today would say that 50% of the wives have now been unfaithful sometimes in their marriage. And perhaps the husbands, it's come down a little bit. I'm not sure about how you go about proving that. You prove it in a peculiar sort of way, but I think that seems to be the evidence. Most of the time, people take common marriage vows. Most of the marriage vows say to one another that they promise to be faithful. Fidelity in marriage is still considered very important. And so what is happening? Half the people are violating their marriage vows. That's what those research findings say. Roughly 50% of the people violate their marriage vows. Kind of sad, isn't it? You know, I've never found a problem in marriage that wasn't a violation of marriage vows, and most of the time it's not infidelity. Most of the time it's the first part of the vow where people promise to love one another. And I think that's important. Here's a question that comes in. It's kind of sad, because I hear these and sometimes I see the people crying and obviously having been battered. It says, my husband abuses me verbally and physically. What can I do? You've heard that often, but you've heard the answers often too. I think the answers are most of the time given in forms of questions. What can you do? First question, is this new behavior, or did it start before you were married? Does it occur only at certain times, such as, excuse me, when the husband is drinking? How serious is it? You know, some people talk about abuse. By comparison to somebody else's abuse, it may be very mild. It may be the worst thing that's happened to that person, but compared to other people, it's very mild. So how serious is it? Another question comes up is, how important is the relationship to you? How important? Okay, so often people in an abusing relationship, they are afraid to turn loose of the relationship, because to be outside of a relationship means I'm a nobody. To some people, that's what it means. They are so afraid of being without the relationship, they'll put up with anything. And another question is, what is the pattern, if any? Most of the time, the patterns are there. Excuse me. Rarely is it random abuse. It's usually specific to a particular person in a particular circumstance. I had a client recently who seemed to feel that her abuse was justified. That somehow it seemed that she was causing it. It turned out that this woman had a prior marriage, and she felt guilty, and she thought the current abuse was justified. So in a way, she was setting it up. In my book, that didn't justify it. She was being hurt, I think, in a serious way, both psychologically and physically. But sometimes these things are based on unresolved factors of the past. And the partner is being used, in effect, being set up. Sometimes abuse is a way of life in some families, and it isn't thought of seriously, either by the husband or wife, until somebody else comes along and says, how can you put up with that? But this is a way of life in some families. So it has to be looked at in perspective. Kind of sad, but that's the truth of the matter. Here's another one. Maybe we'll have time to comment on this one. It says, my fiance says I keep putting her in a catch-22. She explains it, but I don't get it. She says I do it deliberately. Well, a real catch-22 are seldom deliberate. I've researched that. I find that most people can't really set up the pattern of catch-22, meaning to set up a situation where either way a person goes, he's wrong. There is no winning. It's a lose-lose situation. Most people can't think that way. I found by doing some research on it, that kind of thinking seems not to be easily come by. But there are people who seem to do that. Excuse me, it's unconscious, if you will. It's not something deliberately thought out. They seem to be able to do that with other people. And to somebody who does this sort of thing, I would ask a question about what the relationship really means. The party said it's fiancé. And if you deliberately or inadvertently keep putting your partner, the fiancé, in a catch-22 situation, it may mean there's a lot of antagonism there. There's a lot of bitterness there. It may mean, indeed, that there's some deep underlying discontent with the relationship. So I would suggest rethinking it. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. I'll act like it even if I'm not. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. You know, in the North Country here, we have a lot of people who are now retiring, have had early retirements. We've had layoffs, buyouts, and different things. Here's a question that pops up from time to time. I remember it being discussed quite a bit way back when there was this thing called Tri-County Council on Aging, and old Andy C. Mays did a lot of, well, he called it looking into it. He was actually doing some research. Question is it true that a lot of people die after retiring? And the answer is sure. But it's not due to retirement. See, most people die in the 70s and 80s. So they were going to die anyway. You know, a person who retires at 65 nowadays has 16 years of life expectancy. Now that's the average. Some die sooner, some die later. But that was observed quite a few years ago. And the research into retirement found that retirement itself is not particularly stressful. It may be more stressful, for example, on a housewife who's never worked out of the home. When the husband comes home, he's around the house all day. He's now retired. He doesn't leave and give her a break. We used to think we saw that when I worked in mental hospitals. We couldn't understand what we thought was the pattern where a couple been going along an ordinary kind of life, and he retired and then she became mentally ill. We looked at it for a while to think that, well, maybe her illness was due to the stress of his being home. But retirement itself is not noted for being stressful. For some people, it is. Most people it isn't. Most people it's quite a happy occasion and they retire to something rather than from something, and that seems to be the best way of doing it. When people retire today, there are all sorts of programs, pre-retirement planning. Most of the major industries have that type of thing. I used to do it for Plattsburgh State. Continuing Education Department used to put on a pre-retirement workshops for these large companies around here. I'm not sure those were helpful. Oh, it gave people something to do. Let's say that they did help some people think about some of the questions they needed to answer. And even in my own retirement, I didn't carry out all the good advice I gave to other people. I should have. But I can look back on it now and think, well, why didn't I do some of the things that I used to tell other people to consider? Can't answer that. Here's another question, has to do with older people too. And do old people become more religious? Well, that question's been kicked around a lot. The answer is no, not really. It may seem that way because of the disproportionate number of young people who aren't in churches. I've listened to a lot of ministers, rabbis, and pastors discuss this sort of thing about young people are notoriously not there. And what happens is that the old people seem to be the only ones in church. Well, older people. We see that from time to time. Here's another factor to consider, though, that the old people today were reared in a time when society itself was more religious. And so the old people haven't become more religious, they started off more religious and have just continued to move along. I recently went to a church down Syracuse where it was outstanding. It was so different. There were lots of young children in that church. It was quite surprising. I haven't seen anything like that in many years. Excuse me. I inquired and was told, well, it's an Irish neighborhood. It's an Irish community. But that didn't seem to answer all the questions. Well, here's another one. Here's a question. Came in recently, says, I'm Presbyterian, my husband's Catholic. We got married by town justice, and it was my second marriage. We're now breaking up. Do I need an annulment if I want to marry a Catholic? Kind of a complicated question, isn't it? My understanding is it depends on what your first marriage was. But first, see a specialist in that, a priest. Any Catholic priest can give you a definitive answer on that, but here's my understanding so far. That if two baptized Christians marry and they take Christian vows in marriage, whether they're Catholic or not, then that marriage is binding according to the teachings of the Catholic Church. So yes, there would need to be an annulment, if that's possible, from that first marriage, if that was the circumstance of that first marriage. If not, in other words, if it was not a Christian marriage, if both people were not baptized Christians, and there would be other considerations. But what I understand is what the Catholic Church teaches is that God's law prevails. What God said, what God has put together, let no man put asunder. Therefore, baptized Christians who marry under the Christian circumstance, you'd still be married, whether or not you've had civil divorces. But talk to a priest on that one. That's a better way of doing it. Here's another question. Interesting, also, and has to do with religion. Says, my wife is Catholic and wants me to become one. I'm a Southern Baptist. What would you recommend? Well, it's nice for husband and wife to share the same views, same philosophy of life. I find that very important in trying to help people prepare for marriage. That if they share the same philosophy of life, the whys of life, then the chances of getting along are much greater. Getting along well, adjusting well to each other. But I don't know of any minister or priest or rabbi who really recommends somebody changing religion simply to be the same in marriage. At least I've never run across one. Doesn't mean there aren't some out there. Because what you find is that there are more people who change churches than change religions. People may go to a different church, but they may maintain their own religion. So if somebody's going to consider really adopting another religion, that's serious, and it has to be personal. I think you'd find that consistent with any minister or priest or rabbi's recommendation. I think what you will find, if you really look at Southern Baptist and Roman Catholic Church, you're going to be surprised about how similar they are in some respects. Much more so, for example, than the Catholic Church and the American Baptist Church. You know what some of the beliefs are. But here's I think, an important set of recommendations for anybody who wants to get in to study some of these issues. And time by time this comes up because we're having gradually more and more mixed marriages. Mixed in the sense that the husband claims to be one church or religion and the wife another one. Look at the I call them 5 dimensions. I didn't originate this way of looking at it, but the 5 dimensions of religion. I think it's an interesting and a good way to make comparisons of church groups. I think the most important consideration is, what is the ideological difference? What's the ideological dimension of the church you're considering? Are you thinking about, and perhaps even your own religion when you were brought up in? What basic concepts, what beliefs, what precepts, what dogmas, what theology? Some churches don't have those. But what are the ideological things that represent that church, different from other churches? Another way of looking at it is to consider the intellectual. But what is the understanding that the people have? Or what is the way of looking at the ideological dimension? Sort of fancy words, but what is the belief system based on? What are the precepts? What are the matters of faith, if you will? To consider changing, I think it's important to look at. Then there are some more dimensions here that I think need to be looked at. If you're making any kind of comparison, one is, what are the consequences? What does that particular church group teach? It's going to happen or not happen if one follows or doesn't follow the ideological dimensions and principles. What are the consequences? Sometimes we hear churches preaching hellfire and damnation. That's an example of consequences. We hear this church focusing more on punishment for sins than another. Those are consequences. Some churches may not really believe in much sin. And you don't even hear the word sin sometimes in some church groups. There's another important way of looking at it besides the consequences. What's the experiential? What is the feeling level of the people who attend, and what is they have good feelings about when they attend services or participate in that particular religion? The experiential dimension. Very important dimension, very important area to look at. See, some people attend a particular church and say, I really feel good when I go there, and you find that what they really feel good about is that the people there are friendly, jovial, they are warm fellowship, and that's why the people go. They go for different religious reasons, and it may indeed be focused more on the experiential. Another way of looking and comparing churches, for anybody who's serious about that, is the ritualistic dimension. What do the churches do? What does this church do? What are the rubrics? What's the requirement? What does one do or not do in participating in a particular church? Recently I attended a Greek Orthodox wedding. I'd never been to a Greek Orthodox church service before, but I was impressed with the degree of ritual that was involved. Impressed, and I was trying to study it and make comparisons and trying to understand what the ritual meant. Looking at the rituals in terms of what was it supposed to impart to the believers and the participants. I could stay up with the meaning even though the language at that particular group was Greek. I could stay up with most of the rituals trying to figure them out. So you put these things together, excuse me, and you have a way of comparing one church with another. See, so often people say, well, I like to go to this church because I feel good, or I don't like to go to that church because it's always asking for money. Well, all churches have to have money to operate. That's a common denominator. We don't have state-operated, state-funded churches in this country. In some countries they do. Churches and religious groups are basically tax-supported. So looking at these things seriously, a person has to be satisfied within himself. And I think that's the only way that anybody should seriously consider changing churches. It doesn't mean that people of mixed marriage can't participate together. They can for most things. For most parts of the religion, they can certainly be co-participants for the benefit of the children, for the benefit of the unity of the family. But when it comes right down to the personal belief in what one believes in for one's, say, salvation, that has to be a very personal decision. And I think you'll find that's very consistent with the religious leaders. That's what they expect, that's what they want. They don't want half-baked people in the churches. They have enough of them already. I've even heard some people say, and I'm sure any of the listeners have heard say that, well, I don't want to go to that church, there are too many hypocrites. Well, as they always say, there's always room for another one. So that's the answer to that for most church groups. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one.